The sand was still wet from the receding tide when he stepped off the ramp. A wave caught his boot and nearly knocked him down, but he steadied himself with his cane and kept moving. Around him, young soldiers were stumbling through the surf, eyes wide, rifles held above their heads. Some of them were vomiting from the rough channel crossing. Some of them were praying out loud. Most of them had never heard a shot fired in anger. He was 56 years old. He walked with a limp from a German machine gun bullet that had shattered his knee 26 years earlier in a different war against the same enemy. His joints ached with arthritis so severe he could barely climb a ladder. He had recently recovered from pneumonia that had nearly killed him. And he was hiding a heart condition from every doctor in the United States Army because he knew that if they found out, they would never let him be here. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., and on the morning of June 6, 1944, he became the oldest general officer to land on the beaches of Normandy and the only general known to have come ashore by sea with the first wave. He carried no rifle, just a pistol on his hip and a walking cane in his hand. Within minutes, he would face a decision that General Omar Bradley would later call the single bravest act of the entire invasion. The landing craft had drifted. Strong currents and thick smoke from the naval bombardment had pushed the entire first wave nearly a mile south of where they were supposed to be. The careful plans, the months of rehearsal, the sand tables and aerial photographs and memorized terrain features, all of it was now useless. They were in the wrong place. The landmarks did not match. The exits they had studied were nowhere in sight. And 21,000 more men were coming right behind them. A younger officer might have panicked. A more cautious general might have ordered the boats to turn around and try again at the correct location. But Roosevelt looked at the confused young faces around him, looked at the German fortifications ahead, and made an instant decision that would save hundreds of American lives. "We will start the war from right here." That single sentence changed everything about how Utah Beach unfolded. And the story of how a broken-down 56-year-old general came to be standing on that beach in the first place, when every rational calculation said he should have been safely behind the lines, begins with a burden he had carried since childhood, the burden of being Theodore Roosevelt's son. Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. was born on September 13, 1887, at Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, New York. His father was not yet president, not yet the hero of San Juan Hill, but he was already Theodore Roosevelt, police commissioner of New York City, author of best-selling books on the American West, big game hunter, the most famous man in America, and the living embodiment of what he called the strenuous life. For young Ted, that legacy was crushing from the beginning. According to Doug Weed in his book All the President's Children, the weight of expectations nearly buckled him as a child. His father pushed relentlessly, demanding physical and mental toughness in all things. When Ted was about 9 years old, his father gave him a rifle. When the boy asked if it was real, his father loaded it and fired a bullet into the ceiling of their home. The message could not have been clearer. A Roosevelt does not ask questions. A Roosevelt acts. His father drilled military preparedness into all 4 of his sons from their earliest years. Long before the European War had broken over the world, Ted later recalled, Father would discuss with us military training and the necessity for every man being able to take his part in the defense of his country. The dinner table conversation at Sagamore Hill was about duty, about sacrifice, about the obligations of citizenship. Ted wanted desperately to attend West Point or Annapolis, to make the military his career, to follow a clear path to the service his father demanded. But his father refused. Theodore Roosevelt insisted that his namesake attend Harvard, his own alma mater. A Roosevelt should volunteer for military service when the nation called, not make soldiering a profession. The expectation was that Ted would build a civilian life and career, and then drop everything when war came. That call came in April 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Ted Roosevelt sailed for France among the very first American soldiers to cross the Atlantic, holding the rank of major based on his training at the Plattsburgh Citizens Military Training Camp. He was assigned to the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the unit that would become legendary as Big Red One. What followed was a tour through the most brutal combat the American Expeditionary Forces would experience in the Great War, the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918, which became America's first offensive victory of the war, the Marne-Aisne Offensive that summer, the Battle of Soissons, one of the bloodiest engagements American forces had yet faced, and finally the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in the autumn, the largest battle in American military history up to that point. Roosevelt commanded the 1st Battalion of the 26th Infantry under devastating German counterattacks. He later wrote to his family that he was gassed in the lungs and gassed in the eyes, but he refused evacuation and retained command of his battalion while German artillery pounded their positions for 3 days straight. His men held. Then came Soissons on July 19, 1918. Roosevelt was leading his men forward when a German machine gun found him. The bullet shattered his left kneecap. His brother-in-law, Dr. Richard Darby, who was serving as a chief surgeon with the AEF, examined the wound and delivered a grim assessment. Without proper treatment and extended recovery, Ted could lose the leg entirely. Roosevelt reportedly left the hospital early to rejoin his unit. He hobbled back to the front on a leg that had not healed and would never fully heal. He suffered lasting nerve damage in his leg and foot. For the rest of his life, he would walk with a cane, the same cane he would carry onto Utah Beach 26 years later. The war extracted a terrible price from the entire Roosevelt family, not just Ted. His younger brother Quentin, serving as a pilot with the 95th Aero Squadron, was shot down and killed on July 14, 1918, just 5 days before Ted took the bullet at Soissons. Quentin was 20 years old. He went down behind German lines and was buried by the enemy with full military honors, a mark of respect for his father's fame. Brother Archibald suffered a shattered kneecap and broken arm, wounds that would trouble him for decades. Only Kermit, serving with the British in Mesopotamia, came through physically unscathed. And then there was their father. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. never recovered from the news of Quentin's death. Friends said something broke inside him. He had sent all 4 of his sons to war, demanded they serve, and now one of them was dead in a French wheat field at 20 years old. The former president retreated to Sagamore Hill and declined rapidly. He died in his sleep on January 6, 1919, at the age of 60. The official cause was a coronary embolism. The unofficial cause, everyone understood, was a broken heart. Ted Roosevelt ended the Great War as a lieutenant colonel commanding the entire 26th Infantry Regiment. He wore the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism at Cantigny, the Silver Star, and the French Croix de Guerre. He had proven himself in combat beyond any possible doubt. But I think the wound that mattered most was not the one in his knee. It was losing his brother and his father within 6 months of each other. For the rest of his life, Ted Roosevelt would carry a desperate need to prove himself worthy of the family name, to finish what his father and brother had started, to earn his place among the Roosevelt dead. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Roosevelt. Between the wars, Ted Roosevelt lived what amounted to several different careers. He helped found the American Legion, becoming the organization's first national vice commander. He served in the New York State Assembly. President Harding appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position his father had held before resigning to form the Rough Riders and charge up San Juan Hill. He governed Puerto Rico from 1929 to 1932, earning a reputation as an effective and surprisingly progressive administrator. He then moved to the Philippines as Governor General, the highest American official in the islands, serving until 1933. He became a vice president of the Doubleday publishing firm. He joined the board of American Express and eventually became its chairman. Through all of this civilian success, he maintained his connection to the Army Reserve. He attended annual training. He completed the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, the essential credential for higher command. He stayed current on tactics and doctrine. He was preparing, whether consciously or not, for the next war. That war announced itself on September 1st, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. Roosevelt watched from New York as France fell in June 1940 and Britain stood alone against the Nazi onslaught. He knew what was coming. America would fight. And when America fought, a Roosevelt would be there. In April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. returned to active duty at the age of 53. He took command of his old regiment, the 26th Infantry, 1st Infantry Division. By the end of the year, he wore the single star of a brigadier general. He led troops ashore at Oran in Algeria during Operation Torch, the North Africa landings of November 1942. He fought through the disastrous Battle of Kasserine Pass, where inexperienced American forces were badly mauled by Rommel's Africa Corps. He helped rebuild the shattered divisions and push forward through Tunisia. Then came Sicily in July 1943. The 1st Infantry Division landed at Gela and pushed inland against fierce German counterattacks. Roosevelt was everywhere during that campaign, visiting forward positions constantly, exposing himself to fire with a casualness that alarmed his staff. He wore a knitted cap instead of a helmet. He looked, as one soldier put it, like the most beat-up GI you ever saw. The men adored him for it. And then it all fell apart. On August 7, 1943, after the brutal Battle of Troina in the Sicilian mountains, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley relieved both Roosevelt and his division commander, Major General Terry Allen. The 1st Infantry Division had just completed some of the hardest fighting of the campaign, but Bradley had seen enough. He considered Allen and Roosevelt poor disciplinarians who had become too close to their men. The division was magnificently effective in combat, but chaotic in everything else. Officers drank with enlisted men. Salutes were sloppy or non-existent. Uniform regulations were treated as suggestions. George Patton, commanding the 7th Army in Sicily, supported the decision. He wrote in his diary, "There will be a kick over Teddy, but he has to go. Brave, but otherwise, no soldier." I think Bradley was wrong about Roosevelt, though I understand why he made the decision. The 1st Infantry Division had become legendary for its fighting ability and equally legendary for its indiscipline. The men loved Allen and Roosevelt precisely because they did not enforce the spit and polish regulations that other divisions maintained. They were allowed to be scruffy and profane and focused entirely on killing Germans. Bradley saw chaos and unprofessionalism. He saw a unit that would not march in proper formation and whose officers looked like hobos. What he missed, in my view, was that Roosevelt understood something about combat leadership that Bradley, for all his operational brilliance, never quite grasped. In a fight, soldiers do not follow regulations. They follow men they trust with their lives. There's an argument to be made on both sides. Bradley was building an army for the long haul, thinking institutionally about divisions that could function as interchangeable parts. Roosevelt was thinking about the men in front of him. Both approaches have merit. But in the summer of 1943, Bradley held the power, and Bradley made the call. The relief devastated Roosevelt. He was 55 years old, had just been fired from the division he loved, and faced the very real possibility that his combat career was over. He was sent to Sardinia as a liaison officer, a meaningless assignment designed to get him out of the way. He was shuffled to Italy in similar roles. He kept requesting combat command. He kept being denied. There are letters from this period that are painful to read. Roosevelt wrote to friends and family about his frustration, his desperation to get back into the fight, his fear that he would spend the rest of the war shuffling papers while other men did the fighting. He was a Roosevelt. Fighting was what Roosevelts did. Then, in February 1944, Eisenhower gave him one more chance. Roosevelt was assigned as Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry Division under Major General Raymond O. Barton. The 4th was a relatively green unit that had arrived in England only weeks earlier. They had trained extensively in the United States, but had never seen combat. And they were scheduled to land at Utah Beach on the western flank of the Normandy invasion, the first American infantry assault waves to hit the beaches on D-Day. Roosevelt immediately recognized both the challenge and the opportunity. These men needed experienced leadership. They needed someone who had been through the fire and could show them how to survive it. And he needed redemption. He began requesting permission to land with the first wave. General Barton said no. The assistant division commander had no business being in the initial assault. His job was to coordinate from the command ship and come ashore once the beach was secure. Roosevelt would be far more valuable alive than dead, and the first wave would be extraordinarily dangerous. Roosevelt asked again. Barton said no again. Here is where the story becomes extraordinary. Roosevelt had every rational reason to accept Barton's decision and stay on the ship. He was 56 years old. He walked with a cane from his great war wounds. He had severe arthritis that made every movement painful. He had recently recovered from pneumonia that had nearly killed him, and though Barton did not know it, he had a serious heart condition that he was actively hiding from every Army doctor, because he knew they would pull him from command. Any one of these facts should have kept him miles behind the front lines, safely aboard a command ship in the English Channel. All of them together made his request seem almost suicidal. Instead, on May 26, 1944, 11 days before D-Day, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. sat down and wrote a one-page letter to General Barton, making his case to land with the assault companies. That letter is now preserved at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, and it remains one of the most remarkable documents to come out of the Second World War. He opened by arguing that the force and skill with which the first elements hit the beach and proceed may determine the ultimate success of the operation. The first wave would set the tone for everything that followed. If they faltered, the entire assault could fail. If they pushed through, the beachhead would hold. He then made a point about psychology that showed how well he understood young soldiers facing combat for the first time. With troops engaged for the first time, he wrote, the behavior pattern of all is apt to be set by those first engagements. Men who had never been shot at would look to their leaders for cues on how to behave. If the leaders showed fear, the men would feel fear. If the leaders showed calm, the men would find calm. And then he made his central claim, I believe I can contribute materially on all of the above by going in with the assault companies. Furthermore, I personally know both officers and men of these advanced units and believe that it will steady them to know that I am with them. He concluded with a line that revealed everything about who Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was and what drove him. They will figure that if a general is going in, it cannot be that rough. I would love to do this. That final sentence is the one that gets me. I would love to do this. This was not a man accepting a burden. This was a man asking for permission to do the thing he had been born to do. After all the frustration of the past year, after being relieved and shuffled aside and denied combat command, he had found his moment. Barton read the letter and knew he could not refuse. A written request from a general officer demanding to share danger with his men could not simply be filed away, but Barton also knew what he was approving. He later confessed that he felt there was a good chance that Ted Jr. would not survive D-Day. When Barton said goodbye to Roosevelt in England before the invasion, he never expected to see him alive again. 3 days before the assault, Roosevelt wrote to his wife, Eleanor. He told her that he would go in with the assault wave and hit the beach at H-hour. He explained his reasoning with simple clarity. I am doing it because it is the way I can contribute most. It steadies the young men to know I am with them, to see me plodding along with my trench cane. And here is what I cannot stop thinking about when I read that letter. Roosevelt knew he had to know his body was failing. He knew that D-Day might kill him even if the Germans did not. He knew the odds were against him surviving the summer no matter what happened on the beach. He went anyway, because he believed his presence would keep scared young men alive. At 6:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944, the ramp dropped on a Higgins boat carrying E Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was among the first men to step into the cold water of the English Channel and wade toward the beach. He carried a .45 caliber Colt pistol holstered on his hip. In his right hand was the walking cane he had used since Soissons. On his head was his signature green woolen knit cap, not a helmet. He had refused the helmet throughout his time with the 4th Division, just as he had with the 1st. The men needed to see his face. They needed to recognize him. The beach was chaos. Landing craft were disgorging men and equipment all along the waterline. Naval shells were screaming overhead toward German positions. The sound was beyond description, a continuous roar of explosions and engines and shouting voices. The air stank of cordite and diesel fuel and vomit from seasick soldiers. Within minutes of hitting the sand, it became clear that something had gone badly wrong. The strong tidal currents in that part of the channel ran from north to south at several knots. Combined with the thick smoke from the naval bombardment that obscured landmarks, and the loss of 3 of the 4 control vessels to German mines, the entire assault force had drifted approximately 2,000 yards south of the intended landing zone. That is more than a mile. They were supposed to land opposite Exit 3 at a place called Les Dunes de Varaville, where causeways led through the flooded fields behind the beach. Instead, they had come ashore near Exit 2 at La Grande Dune. Nothing looked right. The dunes were in the wrong places. The landmarks the men had memorized from aerial photographs simply were not there. This is the part of the story that most accounts gloss over, so let me explain why it mattered so much. An amphibious assault depends entirely on coordination between dozens of different elements. The naval gunfire has to soften specific targets at specific times. The infantry has to land at specific points where obstacles have been cleared. The engineers have to blow gaps in specific defenses. The armor has to roll up specific routes that have been scouted and planned. The airborne troops landing inland have to secure specific exits and causeways. Every piece connects to every other piece in a precise sequence. When Roosevelt's landing craft touched sand a mile south of where they should have been, the entire mechanism broke down. The exits his men had memorized were not visible. The terrain features they had studied did not exist at this location. The supporting fire plan was aimed at positions they could not see, and 21,000 more men and thousands of vehicles were coming right behind them, expecting to find a beach assault proceeding according to plan. Roosevelt did not hesitate. He grabbed his cane and his map and personally scouted the terrain under German fire. A sergeant from the 8th Infantry Regiment spotted him and later described what he saw. There was General Roosevelt, walking around with a cane in one hand and a map in the other, as if he was looking over some real estate he was thinking of buying. Artillery shells were exploding around him, close enough to shower him with sand and debris. He brushed the dirt off his shoulders impatiently and kept walking, studying the ground, comparing it to his map. After a quick reconnaissance, he conferred with Colonel James Van Fleet, commanding the 8th Infantry, and with the battalion commanders. The question was simple, but the stakes could not have been higher. Do they attempt to relocate the entire invasion force to the original landing zone, a mile to the north, under German fire? Or do they accept the error and attack inland from where they stand? Consider what relocation would have meant. Loading men back onto landing craft under fire, maneuvering those boats a mile up the coast while German artillery adjusted to the new targets, landing again at a beach that had not yet been suppressed by the naval and air bombardment. It would have taken hours. It would have created chaos as successive waves arrived, expecting to find troops moving inland, and instead found empty beach or men loading back onto boats. And it would have left thousands of soldiers exposed on open water or pinned on the sand, perfect targets for German gunners who would have had all the time in the world to zero in. Roosevelt made his decision in minutes. We will start the war from right here. And then came the hard part, because making a decision is one thing. Making thousands of terrified young soldiers believe in that decision, follow that decision, risk their lives on that decision, is something else entirely. For the next several hours, the 56-year-old general with the cane and the knit cap became what one witness called a beacon on Utah Beach. He paced back and forth from the seawall to the surf line, physically grabbing officers and enlisted men and pointing them toward the exits leading inland. He did not stay in one place. He did not find cover. He walked through the fire as if it could not touch him. He repeatedly led groups of men over the seawall himself, walking ahead with his cane despite the German machine gun positions still operating ahead. When young soldiers hesitated at the wall, when they pressed themselves against the sand and refused to move, he stood in front of them and spoke in a calm, unhurried voice. Witnesses reported that he recited poetry, that he told stories about his famous father, that he cracked jokes, Then he put his arm around Shell, shocked boys, and spoke to them gently, as a father would speak to a frightened child. When one soldier staggered onto the beach, completely broken, unable to function, Roosevelt put his arm around him and said, "Son, I think we will get you back on a boat." There was no judgment in his voice, only kindness. He greeted each successive wave of landing craft as they arrived, providing accurate situation reports and pointing newly arrived units toward their changed objectives. He helped untangle traffic jams of tanks and trucks, struggling to move through the soft sand toward the exits. He was everywhere at once, visible to everyone, walking through shell fire as if he were immune to it. By 8:30 that morning, just 2 hours after the first landing, the beach area was almost totally secure. American troops linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne Division late that morning, establishing control of the crucial causeways leading inland. The 4th Infantry Division was off the beach and moving toward its D-Day objectives. When General Barton finally came ashore later that morning, Roosevelt met him on the beach. Barton later wrote, "While I was mentally framing orders, while I was still trying to understand the situation, Ted Roosevelt came up, bursting with information. He had landed with the first wave. He had put my troops across the beach, and he had a perfect picture of the entire situation. This is exactly what Roosevelt had promised in his petition letter, a calm, experienced presence who could process chaos and provide clarity. He delivered precisely that. Now let me give you the numbers that prove why Roosevelt's decision mattered. Utah Beach recorded approximately 197 casualties on D-Day. Some sources put the number slightly higher, around 200, but the order of magnitude is clear. The 4th Infantry Division landed somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 men on June 6th. That is a casualty rate of less than 1%. Compare that to what happened 7 miles to the east at Omaha Beach. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions suffered somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400 casualties on D-Day, out of roughly 34,000 men landed. That is a casualty rate approaching 7%. Omaha Beach was a slaughter. Utah Beach was, by the standards of amphibious assault, almost bloodless. Utah Beach had the lowest loss of life of all 5 Normandy beaches. The lowest casualties, the fastest movement inland, the most complete achievement of D-Day objectives. The contrast with Omaha is instructive. At Omaha, the landings nearly failed entirely. Troops were pinned on the beach for hours. The carefully rehearsed plans fell apart within minutes of the first landing. Leadership at the small unit level was sporadic and often non-existent. Men huddled behind obstacles and waited for someone to tell them what to do. Many of them died waiting. At Utah, the plans also fell apart. The landing was in the wrong place. The terrain was unfamiliar. Everything was improvised. But one man, walking calmly through the fire, provided the leadership that kept things moving. He made decisions. He pointed men toward their objectives. He showed them by his example that forward was possible. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that the difference in outcomes between Utah and Omaha, while certainly influenced by the different defensive situations, was also influenced by the presence of leadership on the beach itself. At Utah, that leadership was Theodore Roosevelt. At Omaha, there was no equivalent figure in the first critical hours. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not arguing that Theodore Roosevelt Jr. single-handedly made Utah Beach a success. Many factors aligned that morning. The naval gunfire was effective. The B-26 Marauder bombers had actually hit their targets at Utah, unlike at Omaha, where clouds forced the bombers to delay their release and drop their loads inland. The German defenses at Utah were weaker than at Omaha, with only a single strongpoint covering the actual landing zone. The airborne troops of the 82nd and 101st Divisions had seized critical objectives inland, despite being scattered all over the Norman countryside. But here's what I believe Roosevelt contributed that morning, and why I think Bradley was right to call it the bravest act of D-Day. He prevented panic. He took a situation that could have devolved into chaos, confusion, and catastrophe, and transformed it, through sheer personal presence, into an orderly and aggressive advance. He gave scared young men, who had never been shot at, who were landing in the wrong place with nothing going according to plan, a reason to believe they would survive. When they saw that 56-year-old general with the cane walking through shell fire as if he was looking over some real estate, they understood something. If he can do it, I can do it. If he is calm, I can be calm. If he is going forward, I can go forward. That is not nothing. In my view, that is leadership at its purest. General Omar Bradley, the same commander who had relieved Roosevelt from the 1st Infantry Division less than a year earlier, was asked later in life to name the single most heroic action he had witnessed in over 40 years of military service. His answer was 4 words: Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach. Bradley also stated in various interviews and writings, "I have never known a braver man nor a more devoted soldier." George Patton, who had supported Roosevelt's relief in Sicily and written in his diary that Ted had to go, changed his assessment after learning of Roosevelt's actions and death. "He was one of the bravest men I ever knew," Patton wrote. Rick Atkinson, the Pulitzer Prize. winning author of The Guns at Last Light, describes Roosevelt as a man both valiant and doomed. Atkinson paints a vivid picture of this short, gnarled, bandy-legged general walking through shellfire with his cane, seemingly immune to fear. But I think the most moving assessment came from General Barton himself, the man who had reluctantly approved Roosevelt's request to land with the first wave, the man who never expected to see him alive again. Barton called Theodore Roosevelt Jr. the most gallant soldier and finest gentleman I have ever known. Roosevelt survived D-Day. He survived the weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting that followed as the 4th Infantry Division pushed inland through the Norman bocage. He was everywhere during that fighting, just as he had been on the beach, visiting forward positions, encouraging tired men, sharing their danger. On the evening of July 12, 1944, 36 days after D-Day, Roosevelt was sleeping in a captured German truck near the village of Méotis in Normandy. He had spent part of that day in a long conversation with his son. This detail still amazes me every time I think about it. Captain Quentin Roosevelt II had landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day with the 1st Infantry Division, his father's old unit. Father and son had both hit the beaches of Normandy on the same morning, landing at 2 different beaches roughly 7 miles apart. They were one of the rare documented father and son pairs to land in Normandy on D-Day. The young captain landed at the most murderous beach of the assault. The old general landed at the most successful one. Both survived. And now 5 weeks later, somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the middle of a brutal campaign that was grinding down both of their divisions, they found each other and talked for hours. What did they discuss? We do not have a complete record. But we know something about what Ted confided to his son during that final conversation. He told Quentin that he had been suffering what he called a series of head pains that came and went. These were almost certainly symptoms of the heart condition he had hidden from everyone throughout the war. He had to have known something was seriously wrong. His heart was failing. The strain of D-Day and the weeks of combat that followed had pushed it past its limits. He said nothing to the doctors. He kept fighting. He planned to keep fighting until it killed him. That night, around 10 o'clock, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was stricken with a massive heart attack. Medical personnel arrived quickly, but there was nothing anyone could do. The damage was too severe. General Barton rushed to the captured German truck where Roosevelt lay. He later wrote, "He was breathing but unconscious when I entered. I sat helpless and watched as the most gallant soldier and finest gentleman I have ever known expired." Roosevelt died around midnight. He was 56 years old. On Eisenhower's desk at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, at that exact moment, reportedly sat a stack of papers that would never be signed. They were orders promoting Theodore Roosevelt Jr. to Major General and assigning him to command the 90th Infantry Division. Eisenhower had finally decided to give Ted the division command he had wanted so badly. Roosevelt died before he ever knew about the promotion. His son Quentin wrote to his mother Eleanor with the news. "The lion is dead," he told her. To me, he was much more than simply a father. He was an amazing combination of father, brother, friend, and comrade in battle. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously on September 21, 1944. Secretary of War Henry Stimson presented it to Eleanor Roosevelt at a ceremony at the Pentagon. The citation reads in part, "After 2 verbal requests to accompany the leading assault elements in the Normandy invasion had been denied, Brigadier General Roosevelt's written request for this mission was approved, and he landed with the first wave of the forces assaulting the enemy-held beaches. He repeatedly led groups from the beach over the seawall and established them inland. His valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack, and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire, inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice." With this award, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., became one of only 2 father and son pairs in American history to both receive the Medal of Honor. The only other pair is Arthur MacArthur and Douglas MacArthur. Roosevelt was initially buried at a temporary military cemetery near Sainte-Mère-Église on July 14, 1944. That was Bastille Day in France. It was also the 26th anniversary of his brother Quentin's death in aerial combat over France during the Great War. The coincidence seems almost too precise to be accidental. Honorary pallbearers at the funeral included Generals Omar Bradley, George Patton, J. Lawton Collins, and Raymond Barton. According to one account, Roosevelt was the only soldier at that temporary cemetery buried in a coffin rather than wrapped in mattress covers, a small mark of distinction for the general who had insisted on sharing every other hardship with his men. Today he rests at the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial at Colleville-sur-Mer in France, overlooking Omaha Beach. In 1955, at the Roosevelt family's request, his brother Quentin's remains were exhumed from the original Great War grave in France and reburied beside Ted. Quentin is the only World War I casualty interred at the Normandy Cemetery. The brothers lie side by side as they had served side by side, 2 generations apart but united in death. The Roosevelt family motto explains the decision. A Roosevelt is buried where a Roosevelt falls. Two brothers, two wars, two generations, lying side by side on a bluff overlooking the beaches of Normandy. Ted and Quentin, reunited at last in French soil, their graves marked by identical white marble crosses. Visitors to the cemetery often stop at those graves, recognizing the famous name, perhaps knowing something of the story. I think about the father who sent them both to war, who demanded that his sons serve regardless of the cost, who never recovered from losing Quentin the first time. I think about Ted, carrying that burden his whole life, trying to live up to impossible expectations, finally proving himself worthy on a beach in France at the age of 56. The Roosevelts believed in duty and sacrifice and death in service to the nation. They paid the price of that belief across 2 world wars. Whether you consider that noble or tragic probably depends on how you feel about war itself. I suspect Ted Roosevelt would not have cared what anyone thought. He had a job to do, and he did it. So what do we make of Theodore Roosevelt Jr.? Let me offer my honest assessment. He was brave beyond any question or doubt. Multiple witnesses describe him walking through artillery fire and machine gun fire as if it could not touch him. Whether this was true courage or fatalism, or simply a man who had already accepted his own death, the effect on the soldiers around him was transformative. They saw a general who shared their danger without flinching, and they followed him over the seawall. He was beloved by his men in a way that few generals ever achieve. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division mourned his relief in Sicily. The soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division followed him through the hedgerows until the day he died. They trusted him because he never asked them to go anywhere he would not go himself. In an age when generals increasingly commanded from bunkers, miles behind the front, Roosevelt commanded from wherever the fighting was hottest. This was not normal behavior for a general in World War II. The role of a brigadier general in an amphibious assault was to coordinate, to communicate, to manage the flow of men and material. It was emphatically not to wade ashore with the first wave carrying only a pistol and a cane. Other generals would have considered such behavior irresponsible at best, suicidal at worst. Roosevelt did not care what other generals thought. He cared about the young men who would be hitting that beach for the first time, who would be terrified and confused and looking for someone to tell them what to do. He believed his presence would steady them. He was right. He was also stubborn to the point of recklessness. Hiding a heart condition from Army doctors in order to remain in combat is not admirable behavior by any conventional standard. It put himself at risk. It potentially put his command at risk. If Roosevelt had collapsed on Utah Beach on the morning of D-Day instead of 5 weeks later in a captured German truck, the consequences could have been severe. But here is what I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot escape when I think about Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He knew. He had to know. He was 56 years old with a body that was falling apart, a shattered knee that never healed, arthritis that made every step painful, lungs scarred by German gas 26 years earlier, and a heart that was giving out, that was sending him warning signals he chose to ignore. He knew D-Day might kill him. He knew the summer campaign would almost certainly kill him. And he wrote that letter anyway, begging for permission to land with the first wave, because he believed that his presence on that beach would save the lives of young soldiers who had never been shot at. He was right. I think Theodore Roosevelt Jr. spent his entire life trying to earn the name he was born with, trying to prove he was worthy of his father, worthy of his dead brother Quentin, worthy of the Roosevelt legacy of service and sacrifice and death in battle. On June 6, 1944, on a beach in Normandy, with a cane in his hand and a failing heart in his chest, he finally succeeded. The 21,000 men who landed at Utah Beach that day had the lowest casualty rate of any Normandy beach. Not all of them knew the general with the knit cap and the walking cane who was strolling around as if he was looking over some real estate, but enough of them saw him. Enough of them were steadied by him. Enough of them followed him over the seawall when every instinct told them to stay down and hide. We will start the war from right here. That was the whole thing. That was Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s contribution to the liberation of Europe. In a moment of maximum chaos, when everything had gone wrong and scared young men were looking for someone to tell them what to do, he made an instant decision and he sold it with his presence. He turned a navigational error into a tactical advantage. He turned terrified boys into soldiers. And then he died, 36 days later, before anyone could pin the second star on his collar or give him the division command he had earned.